Giving effective feedback to your students is a second in a series of 2 webinars on feedback. And in the first one, which we did about a month ago, I went through a series of principles to follow when you give effective feedback to your students. So for this webinar, I'm going to take 4 slides to review them, but the bulk of this webinar will be going through examples and looking at how these principles work in action. So I hope that's what you were expecting, because that's what you're going to get. If I had to write one sentence that describes effective feedback, I would say, describe the work's strengths and make one suggestion for a next step. Does it have to be 1? No, but could be 2. But the principle is not everything. You're not encyclopedically correcting the work. And it's not just correction. Part of effective feedback is helping a student figure out where they are on their journey towards some learning target. So they need to know what they do know, as well as what they need to work on. In order to actually accomplish that, I like to think of 3 views of feedback. Those of you who were here in September, I hope, remember these little lenses. The microscope lens for a detailed look at the words themselves. The camera lens for thinking of what kind of a snapshot or episode of learning is this. And the telescope lens for looking into the future and saying, so, did they learn? So the characteristics of effective feedback are basically that they should be descriptive. Things should be descriptive, timely, and contain just the right amount of information, what the student needs to know to do the next step. You're not reteaching all of their background in this whole topic in one little bit of feedback. You're just moving learning forward. You need to be positive, clear, and specific. We went through all of these last month, and so I'm not going to read them all to you again, but it is important that you have this as a foundation, and there's the slide for it, which you can go and get after the broadcast on the web if you want. But another thing, you could say all the right words, that just the most wonderful, effectively written bits of feedback, or you could say the most wonderful things. If the student, for some reason, doesn't learn anything, it's not going to be effective feedback. And if you didn't learn something about what the student is thinking, it's not effective feedback. This is a tricky one. Many teachers approach feedback as if it were correcting, not students, not responding to their thinking. If all you're doing is correcting students' work, then student understanding won't be advanced. They'll make the corrections you ask them to make, but they may or may not understand what it is, why that makes something better. Pardon me. And then the long view. Feedback isn't effective for learning unless you give students an opportunity to use it, which means just writing something on a paper but not giving them time in class or another assignment shortly in the very near future where they can actually use that feedback. It won't help. If you think students will just kind of memorize what you write and use it again a month from now when a similar assignment comes up, you are kidding yourself. That is just not how learning works, even with the most dedicated students. So you need also to have effective feedback to build in an opportunity for students to use it right then or the very next day or something like that. So with that as an introduction, and for those of you who are just joining and didn't see the last webinar where we went through all of those points in great detail, that webinar is up. You can go back and watch it. But we're going to go on and we're going to spend the rest of this webinar looking at examples. Some of them written examples and some of them video examples. Here we have an example. Now this was a whole test. And this student unfortunately got feedback like this for the whole test. So the teacher took a thick marker and underlined and put an exclamation point next to show all steps. The steps are worth points. And then wrote the dark stuff that you see there. The student wrote the lighter stuff, which I think was in pencil. That's why I didn't scan so well. So take a look at this and pretend that you are that student. If you were this student, what would this feedback make you want to do? If you were this student, how would you experience this feedback? In fact, I have a poll question for that. If I did this right, you ought to be looking at a question that says, what is the tone of this feedback? Is it descriptive or evaluative? And it looks like almost everybody who's wanted to vote has voted. And I think voted very wisely. Yes, this feedback comes across as very evaluative, very judgmental, which means the student is not going to be very motivated. It's the first thing it's going to do is make the student feel bad. And that is not going to help them say, oh, I need to figure out how to do this better. So one of the things that you need, the teacher may be right. In fact, the teacher is right. These problems, none of them were well done, and they did not use inverse operations, which was what the teacher had intended the students to do. But this feedback is not going to get the students to do that. So good for you. Analyze that one well. The next example is going to be oral feedback. A student has turned in a science portfolio, and the teacher is going over it. The part on the video you are going to see is her going over one of his science tests, which has been in the portfolio. And I want you to watch the student's face. The teacher gives several different kinds of feedback. Oh, this is a very good example. She does a nice job here. But what is it that makes the kids smile?
This is your Chapter 10 genetics portfolio, okay? And I just wanted to kind of go through it with you and tell you what I thought was really good, ways you might improve, and so forth, okay? Let's take a look at your test that you took. You just did an amazing job on the test. I mean, wow. But what I really liked about it was your attention to detail, and that I can clearly see how you got 8 of these were round and yellow, 8 of these were round or wrinkled and green, and how you ended up. And then if I had any question, I could refer to your data. So that was really excellent. And just the attention to detail was awesome. And that's something that's improved in you since last semester. Because last semester, you remember what this would have looked like, and kind of all over the place. And so you've made a dramatic change.
Okay, I hope you had a chance to watch the young man's face. So she went over the test. She was very descriptive. She gave him some feedback about what she liked about. She told him what the strengths were. And then she made a comment about his prior performance. So your poll question is, whoops, that's not right. Poll question is, what kind of feedback was it that made the student smile? She gave 2 of these kinds of feedback, but one of them made him really smile. It was toward the end. Excellent. Yes, you've got it. She gave mostly criterion reference feedback. That is, she described what it was that the student was able to do well. And that is, in fact, a characteristic of effective feedback. But when he smiled was when she said, you remember what this would have looked like last year, reminding him that he has come a long way. And that's what made him smile. That is a self-reference comment, feedback that refers to a student's own past work or your expectations for the student. And so feedback should not be completely self-referenced. Students should know. It should be mainly criterion reference. Students should know what it is that they are doing well and what it is they need to still work on. But a little self-referenced feedback to show students that their efforts and their work and their learning is paying off can be really motivating. And I just love that. That's not why that example was actually filmed, but when it turned out to have that little bit in it, I just thought that was really precious. Okay, next example. This one is 4th grade, reading and social studies. It's written feedback. The teacher had asked the students to read a story about endangered species, an informational text, I should say, about endangered species. And then she had a mixed reading and social studies assignment here, so they were supposed to answer the questions, but they were also supposed to use their sentencing skills, capitals and periods, complete thoughts, all of that. So here we have a successful student, and this is the reason that I picked this to show you that even successful students can have something that will light the way forward. This student answered the questions well, because with details from the story. Why are some animals at risk of dying out? Animals are dying because people are cutting down trees, and so on, polluting and hunting. And so this student didn't need to do anything further as far as comprehending this story. She didn't need to do anything further really about her use of standard written English. So this teacher did what I thought was brilliant. She gave the students some thought questions. Not another assignment, not go write an essay about these, just something to think about that pushed her thinking in the area that they were studying. Now, I personally think this teacher, it was a little bit of overkill. There are 5 thought questions here. I think 1 or 2 would have done it. But some of them are really interesting thought questions. For instance, the young lady wrote, I assume young lady because the handwriting is neat. I don't really know the student. But she said that hunting was a problem. So the teacher said, what would happen if we stopped hunting completely? Which is an interesting thing to contemplate. And in northwestern Pennsylvania, which is where this example comes from, hunting is actually a big thing. Deer hunting especially, but it's something that is done, and people eat venison, and so that's not just an idle question there. Some of those questions, I think, take the student what she comprehended from the story and push her thinking, giving her the message that learning never stops, but giving forward-thinking feedback to a student so she doesn't get the idea, well, the assignment is done and I did it well and that's all. Check, done. I really like that. And I think that there are too few people who give really good feedback to successful students. Having said all that, I think 1 or 2 thought questions would have done it. I don't think she needed 5. Now, here, however, is an example from the same class of one of her unsuccessful students. Take a minute to notice what most of this feedback is about. Is it mostly about the content of the informational text, the social studies understandings, or is it mostly about the English mechanics? Yeah, you're right, Rebecca. No thought questions. It's just all correcting. And it's all correcting of English, with the single exception of the little yes on question 2. If you actually read the content, though, the student has understood what was written. Plant more trees or make more ponds for fish or animals. The content is fine, and yet the tone of this feedback is most of what I care about. Says to the student, most of what the teacher cares about is English grammar, and shows that English grammar isn't so good And so that's a problem. The student doesn't get anything except one little yes and that little sort of part happy face, whatever that is there, to say anything about the content of what he's written. I think that's too bad, and I really think it's sad that the teacher who did such a nice job with the successful student shortchanged the unsuccessful student. So I give you that as food for thought. This is only, 2 papers out of this teacher's life. I am not trying to criticize the teacher. I'm just using these examples as ways that we can take examples of how to give better feedback. Okay. Here's one. It's a much more on the fly. It's a video, and I'll tell you that what I want you to watch for is the interchange between the student and the teacher. This is a 9th grader trying to do some writing, and he's having trouble coming up with the right words. And the teacher is just walking around among desks, and the video you're going to see is he stopped at the desk of this one young man, and he has a little conversation. Part of the reason I chose this feedback example is that it is a conversation. It's not just the teacher telling the student something, but the student and the teacher have actually a little feedback dialogue. And I think it's a nice example of that, the snapshot view of, you can see an episode of learning happening. You can see what the student is learning about word choice, and you can see what the teacher is learning about how the student is thinking.
In the sentence, the sunlight's dappling. Over here, the moonlight is going to do what?
Same thing.
Okay. Instead
Shine.
of using the same word. Shining, good. What's the next part? Sunlight through the trees, dappling along blue cloak, shining.
Over his face.
There you go. See, you know this. Got it.
Let me ask you a question. What do you think the teacher was mainly trying to accomplish with that little feedback episode? It was feedback on work in progress. The writing wasn't done. It was feedback as the student was writing. What do you think the teacher was trying to accomplish? Instill some confidence, support, encouragement? Yes? Get him to work on his own independently? Yes. All right, so those are the 2 affective and work habitsy kinds of things that came out loud and clear. There was also some content feedback going on there, but it wasn't as obvious. The student was having trouble picking a word for what the moon was going to do, and so the teacher redirected him back to a previous sentence that talked about the sun. Extending his thinking. Yes. He was showing the student the kind of connections that you can make as you're writing to make the word choice flow and also be sort of coherent through a piece. And he didn't do it by saying, now go back and look at the sun sentence. He did it very naturally by saying, okay, the sun is dappling, so the moon could be, by example, teaching the student how to do that himself. So, yes, and whoever just said Kelly, he was trying to get the student to describe, but he made the student do it himself. But he didn't just say, okay, describe. He gave him a tool. And the tool was that comparison back to the previous sentence. It was just a lovely little example of teaching more than you might think. And what the student got was the content just slipped by so naturally that the teacher was able to make those confidence-building things, which I suspect the student heard loud and clear as well. So anyway, I think that's a really nice example of the episode of learning part of feedback. And an immediate opportunity to use. The student actually, literally, immediately was able to put those words into his work. Okay, now I have an extended example here of several students who's from a kindergarten, and the goal was that students will make equal sets. And the look-fors, the criteria were that the sets were supposed to be lined up so that a one-to-one comparison was possible. So here is a successful student who made a set of 4 yellows and made a set of one-to-one a one-to-one comparison there. So that is actually what the teacher was going for. Look at the next one here. This student is on the way. The example is not a bunch of random dots thrown all over the paper. The student clearly is in the process of getting the concept that sets need to be lined up so that a one-to-one correspondence is evident. And the teacher feedback was, and I'm going to read it to you because in my machine it's so tiny. Forgive me if you're already reading this just fine all by yourself. But her feedback was, are your 2 sets equal? Are they the same? Let's make sure. Let's check your work by making a partner for each. By that she meant 1 yellow for 1 red. That was her feedback. So, again, a sort of an example of helping the student figure it out. If she had made the connections herself, like drawn lines from 1 yellow to 1 red, it wouldn't have had the same effect. So the student then did what the teacher asked, and lo and behold, he had 1 yellow left, or she, I don't know which student it was, had 1 yellow left over. So this is what happened when the student used that feedback, which is the long view. So was this feedback effective? Yes, because it got the student to the point where he could see what he needed to do next, which was get rid of a yellow one. And that is what he did. And so the student removed the yellow counter, and the teacher said, remember our target was to show equal sets. Have you done that here? And the student, of course, would say yes. So I like this little sequence because it shows a couple things. One is it shows that the principles for feedback work even for little tiny kids. And 2 is that it shows this sort of feedback in action. So I'm going to give you a poll question. If you don't recognize reminder, scaffold, and example feedback, those are from the last section. Was she just reminding him what they were learning? Was she scaffolding his understanding by kind of like the 9th grade teacher was doing? Or did she actually do it for him and give him an example? All right. Yes, indeed. That is a good example of scaffolded feedback. When the teacher, back to here, when she said, are your 2 sets equal? That was a question that scaffolded student thinking. She didn't say, okay, draw some lines, connect them, because the prior thing that the student needed to understand, that drawing lines and connecting them or lining them up was actually checking for this to see if the 2 sets were equal. And then she gave him a strategy. Why don't you line them up? Why don't you put them in partners? And we have the proof that it was in fact effective. So that's another example. And because it's kindergarten, it's kind of fun to use. Okay, the next example is a 5th grade math, oral feedback on subtraction with borrowing. I love this episode with one big exception. I think the teacher did a marvelous job of showing the student progress, of describing what it was that he was learning, of helping him see that his own effort had led to improvement, and then see what you think is the notable exception that that if she had it to do all over again, I wish she wouldn't have done. So with that as your sort of reason for watching the video. So excellent feedback with one exception. See if you can find out what it was.
Okay, this one, 7,300 minus 2,379. Again, it got really tricky where the zeros were, because that's when it gets all scary, when we start borrowing and borrowing and borrowing, right? When we get to those problems, we probably need to stop and think. Okay, so you have made, look at this, comparing the two. Look at the great progress that you've made. On this page, there was a lot of incorrect problems and very little work. You did not show me your work. But on this page, there were only 2 incorrect problems, and you did a whole lot of work. I can see where you borrowed, and I can see how you thought through each problem. It's gotten so much better. What I want you to do is see if we can do it one more time and get 100. I think you can do it. Do you think you can do it? What do you think you're going to do next time to be able to get all of these correct? We've gotten better each and every time. What can we do to do our very best on this one?
Slow down.
Slow down? That's a good strategy. Anything else you think we could do? Where was the specific place that you didn't have trouble subtracting? You had trouble when we were doing what? Regrouping and borrowing. So maybe slow down, especially when we get to those sections. You ready to try it? I think you can get 100. Go ahead and go.
Okay, one thing to notice was that same smile on this little 5th grader's face as the 9th grade science student. When she did that comparison with how much better are you now than you used to be, he had this little smile on his face like, yay me. So she had criteria. She was looking for correct answers, and she was also looking for showing work. And she pointed out to him the difference. And somebody's already answering my question. Yes. I would say I would agree with all of the people who are now typing. Why did she ask him to do it again and get 100 when he had done that whole page and gone from having most of them wrong to having only 2 wrong? At best, she could have said, okay, why don't you try to redo these 2? But to make him redo a whole page that he'd already done mostly correctly seems to be sort of, especially after all that wonderful feedback. If she hadn't done such a beautiful job of pointing out to him what she was looking for and how he had improved and what he was going to continue to do next. So I'm not sure what was up with that. I really am not, because that teacher, I have her in some other videos as well. She is a marvelous teacher. I can't imagine. I don't have the ability to ask her what she was thinking. I would have either made him do those 2 again, or given him his next assignment that was because he was certainly ready for moving on to whatever they were doing next. That would have included his using the borrowing that he had clearly learned how to do. So, all right, I'm mindful of the time. I should move on. I can get talking there. So here is a high school example, and the prompt was, why is it called A Rose for Emily? It's a short story. Why is it called A Rose for Emily when there is no rose in the when there is no rose in the story? So I'll give you a minute just to look. Hopefully you can maximize your. Yes, you can maximize it, because I just did. And so the first paragraph is the good part. Then she sort of starts to wander. But The story is titled A Rose for Emily because roses represent eternal love, and Emily wants someone to love forever. Emily has been alone for most of her life. She wants somebody to love and for that person to always love her back. When she finally gets a husband, she does everything possible to make sure he will always be with her. By poisoning him, Emily has sealed the deal with him, never leaving. She finally has someone who will always love her just like a rose. I won't read the second paragraph to you, but I will read the teacher feedback again. Forgive me if your computer is big and clear and you're not having any trouble reading this. Great job. Everything is where it needs to be, and I have no questions like why or how. Okay, so I have a poll question for this one, I think. Yes, I do. Poll question. It's not horrible feedback, but something is missing. Okay, it looks like the voting has slowed to a stop, so I'm going to close it. And yes, again, you're right. What is missing is suggestions for next steps in learning. That is a very nice first paragraph. The student clearly understood the story, but that is definitely not ready to be just copied over I think the teacher needs to be clearer about what it is that that the author does well, and I think she needs to give her a chance to add some things, especially in the second paragraph, which is the one I didn't read to you, which kind of wanders around. Yes, it is surprising to me that the teacher believes this is a perfect response. Okay, and again, here's some writing, but this time from a very different grade level. Actually, this isn't from this Thanksgiving. This is from several years ago, but it's oddly appropriate for a late October webinar. It was a persuasive writing and sentencing skills assignment, and the turkey was supposed to be writing to the farmer to try and persuade him to eat something besides turkey for Thanksgiving. Dear Mr. Farmer, I think you shouldn't eat turkeys for Thanksgiving. I'm skinny. I have ticks. They will make you sick. And so on. So the feedback is what the teacher has printed there in kind of like a flare pen marker. She corrected some grammar and usage errors, and then she wrote, "Your friend, Mr. Turkey," because he didn't finish his letter form. And the teacher wrote, "Where's your closing sentence? Why are you skinny? How will you peek inside my stomach? We need to work on capitalization and punctuation." Okay, because of time, I'm going to just give you what I think about this one, rather than asking you to weigh in, although I see a lot of you weighing in with some things that I also would say. I think that's what, if I were teaching persuasive writing, I would want the kid to know these are really clever reasons. I'm going to make you sick. I'm skinny. You wouldn't have any fun eating me. Those are, if you understand persuasive writing, you understand that this kid is giving reasons that are intended to persuade. And I think a comment on the content and the persuasive writing, state what you're trying to persuade, which you did. Don't eat me, and then give reasons that back it up. The student has that down, and there's nothing here that tells the student that. And then there's something about the tone of this that sounds, I don't think it's meant to be judgmental, but this "we need to work on capitalization and punctuation" strikes me like the nurse in the hospital room saying, "And how are we feeling today?" somehow. It needs a little work. And also, I think it's too much. I mean, that's a third grader. Look at the writing. That is not the world's best third grade writer. So you're not going to fix everything about this student's writing in one set of feedback. Pick your battles. What would you like the student to work on next? Is it capitalization and punctuation? Then say, you wrote such a wonderful persuasive paragraph that I think we're going to focus on how you wrote it next, because your reasons are just great. We don't need to change those, or something, rather than the way it's put there. Yes, lacks a positive tone. It's not, I have had people respond to this, don't correct everything. Well, the student won't know I think it's wrong. Well, true. But think of it as an episode in the student's learning life, because that's what it is. When this kid gets this paper back, instead of saying, oh, look, the teacher has very comprehensively corrected all of the errors in my paper. That's not what the student is going to think. The student is going to think, ugh, got a lot of writing on this one. And the function of the feedback isn't to correct everything the student never learned for 3 whole years in school, which is sort of what the teacher's trying to do here. The function of feedback on any one paper is to move the student one notch along in that learning journey toward, in this case, persuasive writing and sentencing skills. And I think feedback like this sort of just shuts down the action. Okay, there's my examples, and I've run only a couple of minutes into the question section, so Adrian, I didn't do too badly. So, what I'm going to invite you to do now is to write questions into the text chat, and also Adrian has been collecting some of the questions that have come along as we've been talking. So I'm going to see what I can have here. Many of my colleagues give very little feedback because they get frustrated that the students ignore the feedback and just look at the grade. Thank you, David. This gives me an opportunity to make 2 points, and I hope both of them are helpful to you. One is, don't give a bunch of feedback on graded work. It's too late. Give the feedback on practice work, on the learning work. And I see that you're a high school teacher. If you are in a high school where absolutely everything the students do is graded, rethink that. What sort of grade should a student get for trying something the very first time or practicing it the very second time? Build in feedback opportunities into your lesson plans in a unit so that by the time the student gets to when it's graded, you can just grade it, give it back. Or if you want to make a few comments about why they missed a point or something, you can do that. But if there are both grades and feedback on a paper, students will just look at the grade. That is, there is research that shows that, as well as teacher experience. And the other thing that I would say is, if students, you have to give feedback and then act. Part of feedback is the lesson plan that comes next, where you engineer an opportunity for students to use the feedback. They won't use it if they don't have a need to or an opportunity to. So that's my 2 answers to that question. Is one is, if you give feedback when there's no opportunity to use it, why should they? Whether they ignore it or not, it doesn't matter. It's a moot point. And the other thing is to build feedback opportunities into the actual teaching of your unit, so that when they get to the grade part, the feedback for improvement is sort of over. What do you say to teachers who say, I can't possibly give this much feedback to all my students? Well, I say a couple of things. One is the one I just said to David, and that is, save yourself a whole bunch of time. When you're grading papers, give very little feedback. Give feedback on work in progress. And one of the reasons that I selected some of the videos that I did is that some of those show teachers giving feedback in conversations with students as class is going on. You're going to talk to your students anyway. You're going to say something to them. It might as well be communication that is effective feedback. So instead of just sort of wasted or comments that don't particularly focus on criteria and learning. So I would say both of those things, not at the end, and make sure that all of your, when you talk to students, you've got your feedback head on with your 3 little lenses. I guess the other thing I would say is I'm actually recommending less feedback. For example, this turkey thing that's still up where the teacher wrote as much to the kid as the kid wrote to her, that's too much. And we've said that. Describe a strength and make a suggestion or two, if it's a student who can handle two, for improvement. In some cases, teachers need to write less feedback. Okay? What about the color of your pen? Because we mostly use red pen for mistakes. Does that play a role? You know, I am not, I understand that, and if you want to use green or pink, that's fine with me. I don't, at my age, I kind of like a separate color so I can see what's, when I edit my own work, I use red, so I can see it. I don't know that, you know, red gets a bad rap because we have used it for all this bad feedback. But I do understand the argument, and in this day and age, there are some lovely colors of, you no longer are limited to red, blue, and black. There are lots and lots of colors of markers. Some of them are beautiful. And as far as I'm concerned, pick a color that you really think is cool, turquoise or something, and make it your signature color. But I worry less about the color of the feedback than about the content of the feedback. Students won't experience it as corrections if you are talking about their thinking. Do you see student metacognitive reflection as part of the process? Not all left to the teacher. Yes, indeed. I think the good examples of feedback that we saw, even the tiny ones, had, we only saw a few seconds of a teacher's life, but the high school teacher asking the student to reflect, the elementary school teacher asking the 5th grade boy what he thinks he should do next when he does his next work, even though we all agreed it shouldn't be to do that same paper over again. Student metacognitive reflection is good feedback, helps the whole student self-regulation of learning process along, from seeing what your next goal should be to giving you tools to monitor it and adjust your work as you go. So yes, indeed, good feedback should play into that whole student thinking, self-reflection, and self-regulation of learning. So I would agree, and this is Alan Cooper from New Zealand, where I actually can say in New Zealand they do student assessment very well. And they have a higher view of teacher feedback than we do here, where we sometimes think, well, the teacher can say what she wants, but we'll see how the standardized test comes out. New Zealand is a model for good assessment. And so, Ellen, I hope you are enjoying being in that context and teaching there. And here's a question. Suggestions on oral feedback when your student is sensitive and hard on themselves when they make mistakes. That's a good question. This is Robin. Yes, if your feedback has all those parts, you know, it's descriptive, it's timely, it comments on the work, but if a student is fragile because they think they're dumb and they don't think they can do the work, they have very low appraisal of their own abilities, then sometimes even very effective sounding feedback the student will hear as just one more reason why I'm too dumb to do anything. So you need to make sure that that you deal with the negative feelings first. And I say this very tentatively because for most students this is not the case, and you need to go right to how does your work, describing their work against criteria. But for the few fragile students, where you really do need to deal with the negative feelings of, oh, I can't do this first, before you actually give them their suggestions for next steps. The best advice that I can give you is to go to self-referenced feedback, which is usually a no-lose situation. Because if the student is not a very high achiever, but did at least something last time and did something sort of bad this time, you can say, oh, I know you can do it. Do you remember what you did last time? And if a student did it this time than the last time, then that works. That will get you one of those little smiles like we got from our 9th grader or our 5th grader in the videos. This is better than last time. Let me tell you why it's better than last time, because you did this and this and this. That's what you were trying to learn. So anyway, self-referenced feedback, and it is often a good way to deal with that sort of negative emotions and then get them to the place where they can hear the more criterion reference feedback. I'm Laura. Thoughts on peer feedback in 2 minutes. Oh dear. Actually, I have just finished doing a literature review on the differences between self-assessment and peer assessment. And there are some. Self-assessment helps with what Ellen was talking about. It helps students with that self-regulation of learning process. It's as good or as bad as your own effort, and it's as good or as bad as the criteria that you are either given to work with or that you generate with your classmates to work with. Peer feedback can be very positive and very powerful, and it also can be not so powerful. Students tend to like peer feedback when it's helpful and competent, and they tend to think of it as a waste of time if it's not, and you cannot always guarantee the quality of the peer feedback. There's some social stuff going on. There's a little bit of research that suggests students enjoy peer feedback when they have as a partner someone who behaves properly in the peer feedback setting, and not all students will. So the key to that is a lot of training. If you want to use peer feedback, there's a whole education process you have to use to teach kids how to look at the work against criteria and not just to chat or to respond to irrelevant things. As students get older, high school and in college, they tend not to want peer feedback because they tend to value what the teacher, who is the one who is going to grade them, thinks. And I know that we have done that to our students. We're the ones who ruined them by always emphasizing the grades. But there is that dynamic when you use peer feedback with the older kids. So, thoughts on peer feedback? If you can arrange to do it really well, it can be very helpful. It helps with that sort of we're learning together, that social constructivist view of learning. And it is true that two heads that are actually working are always smarter than one, but it has to be handled well, and you have to teach kids how to do it well. And it isn't always popular. Peer learning, on the other hand, one way to get around this is to do a lot of peer learning and then have the feedback done by self or teacher. And that way you get all the benefits of the peers learning together, but you take that assessment part out and put it where many students tend to want it to be. So those are some ways you can approach that.